Well, things were kind of scary last night. No matter where you are or who you plan to vote for in November, what happened in Pennsylvania last night gave us all a sense of unease. And if you were like me, you were glued to the TV or internet for long periods of time. In the aftermath of that attempted assassination and collateral loss of life, you could hear all the opinions, you could hear the speculations, all that was rampant, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet that is not quite true, but it happens in this day and age. People pointing fingers already on both sides of the aisle. What I find fascinating is about all these conversations, this is going on for a long time, is that as people on both sides of the aisle are trying to make their point about, trying to make sense of what has happened, everybody is marshaling the law or morals to make their point. Some are even using the Bible to make their point. It's quick to do that, especially when there's anger. And we're always ready to do this and to use the law, use God's commands against the person that we don't like. That's our society today. Well, it's in that context, in that environment. That environment was actually part of the context into which this letter, this sermon from Hebrews was given originally. It has a lot to say to us. Because in this moment, in this time, in this context, in our environment, we must again go back to the gospel. The gospel has something to say to us. The gospel has something to speak into where we find ourselves. We don't know what the future holds. We have no idea how this is all going to play out. We don't. Our text today is help for this moment. Now, we are making our way through the Bible in 14 months. We're in the middle of our Bible binge. And this week, we are in the book of Hebrews. Like I said before, I'm kind of tempted to spend a couple of weeks here because there's so much that is going on in Hebrews with the storyline of the Bible. We often say, and this is right, the entire Bible is about Jesus. And you've also often heard us say that the theme verse for the Bible is found in John's biography of Jesus. And John writes, the Bible's been written that you would believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's actually God, and by believing, have life in his name. So if the whole Bible's about Jesus, and the whole theme is, this is who Jesus is and who he is for us, the book of Hebrews is a really good place for us to help us understand just what this storyline in the Bible is all about. If it's all about Jesus, the book of Hebrews is a great place to go to help us understand just what is going on with Jesus. Now, we're going to start today just like we have with some of the past books that we've been in. We're going to start with a little help from the Bible Project, and we're going to move from there.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was, or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah, and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this, is to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus.
All right, so that's the opening for Hebrews. Now we're going to summarize kind of what we just heard. We're going to add a little bit to it. When we're reading Hebrews this week, here's a summary. We just heard this. First of all, we don't know who wrote the book. Secondly, something he didn't mention here, Hebrews is a sermon. You think some sermons are long? There's quite a few chapters in Hebrews. 13, 14. But it's a sermon. So beginning to end, a congregation like this in the first century is listening to somebody read Hebrews as a sermon. As he mentioned, Hebrews written to Jewish Christians. Hebrews was written to show that Jesus is better than. That's a running theme through the whole book. And then as he mentioned, Jesus was written to warn the church against abandoning Jesus. But there is a main theme here. There is one better than that sticks out from all the rest. And that Jesus is a better high priest. We're going to look at this in a second. But that's this sermon in a nutshell. And what's going on with Hebrews, as he mentioned, they're undergoing persecution. They're being thrown in jail. Their houses are being burned down. All sorts of bad things are going on. And the reason he's running to this better than idea is because many of them in this congregation or many congregations are beginning to think, you know what? Life was a whole lot easier when we were in the synagogue. Life was a whole lot easier when we embraced Judaism. We embraced this Jesus guy. He gave us life. He gave us salvation. But I don't know. With all this bad stuff happening, is this all worth it? Is he really better than what we knew from our Old Testaments and the life that we knew in Judaism? So Jesus is better than. That's the running theme through Hebrews. And Jesus is the ultimate better. He's better than anything that has come before. He surpasses all of the Old Testament. So we're going to run through these. He kind of summarized some of them. We're going to run through these. First of all, Jesus is better than the angels. He starts off, it's a very interesting way of beginning his book. That Jesus is the last word from heaven, and because he's the last word from God himself, he's better than the angels. We're not sure why he starts there. Our guess is in studying what was going on in Judaism at the time, angels were a big deal. Angels were a very, very big deal to them. And then Jesus is better than Moses. Now that got people into trouble saying that kind of stuff. I mean, Jesus was put on trial. Stephen was put on trial for that. Jesus is better than Moses. But the writer is saying, look, Jesus is better than that. But then Jesus is a better, and so he runs through some of these that we find in our Old Testaments. Jesus is a better sacrifice. Jesus is a better covenant. Jesus is a better hope. He's a better possession. He's a better high priest. So we have all these things. We're not going to go into all these details. Again, that's part of our Bible reading during the week. But it's making, again, everything that you know to be true about Judaism, Jesus is better than. But that also is true for Christians. Here's how it affects you. You're in a better place now. You have a better resurrection now. You have a better inheritance because of the promises. This makes some people uncomfortable, especially when we start going back to the Old Testament, trying to live our lives through the Old Testament. We're actually, because of the cross of resurrection, we're in a different place now. We have it better than. So you get the point, right? The church is suffering persecution. They're having questions. Should we continue? I want to go back to where it was easier. Jesus is better than. There's nothing about Judaism that is better than Jesus. There's nothing about the world that you know or that you think you know that is better than Jesus. In fact, he says, controversial even at that time, that all that stuff in the Old Covenant, that's becoming obsolete. Everything you know to be true because Jesus has died and risen. But the main focus, and the one we're honing in on this morning, is just this one biggie. And it really doesn't resonate with us. The more I looked at this, even this week, I'm thinking, this doesn't really resonate with us. For some reason, some of us were very comfortable talking this way. And I think, too, is we're just like, I'm not sure I see how this fits. But its main biggie is that Jesus is a better high priest. In fact, all of these things can be all summed up. All the stuff that we just looked at can be summed up in this, that Jesus is a better high priest who made a better sacrifice. He's a better high priest. Now, we probably have to explain, again, because we're in a different kind of context here. We're not only 2,000 years removed, most of us are Gentiles here. What's the big deal about a priest? And again, this is why some of this doesn't resonate with us. But God set up priests when he rescued Israel from Egypt, and they go through the Red Sea in a miraculous way. They end up at this mountain called Sinai. This mountain, God gives them the law. And as he is basically giving them their order of worship, he sets up this priest system. And so all the things, even some of the probably caricatures that we think of priests kind of go back to some of this. That God says, this is how you're going to worship me. He's setting them up as worship leaders. But there's a little more going on to priests than just being worship leaders. They did do that for Israel out of their tabernacle and their temple and all the other places. The priest was a mediator between the people and God. And again, we could look at that and like, oh, okay, I understand that. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because remember what happened back in the garden? Adam and Eve, again, decided to do their own thing, go their own way, in rebellion. That relationship with God was fractured. And all of a sudden, they lose access to God. You see, access to God isn't just simply a matter of, oh, hey, God, I've got this issue. I've got this problem. I need your help. We're used to living that way, but we don't start to think about what's part of the nuts and bolts of why all that happens. They lost access to God because of sin. And so there's this fracture. So God says, you know what? You can't come see me. And he says, when God comes to dwell among men on earth, he sets up his tabernacle, and in the tabernacle, that's where he's dwelling. You know what? You can't come in here. You can't come see me. Only the priests. And only through sacrifice. They have to set up this mediation system because of sin. And the big guy is the high priest. And he's the one guy that is allowed into that inner sanctum once a year, where nobody else is allowed to go, to make the atonement sacrifice for sin for the whole nation. Only one time a year. High priest was a big deal. In fact, if you start looking at the way the high priest functions in that kind of context, you begin to think and realize, like I think this writer of Hebrews does, the priest is probably the most important guy in the whole nation. And I know there are some kings that showed up that had a different idea about that, and they learned the hard way. No, you know what? Your access to God still comes through the priest. The high priest. So God's relationship broken sets up a mediation system whereby he is now working with and communicating with and dwelling among people only through a mediator. Because of the fracture. You had to have help to get to God, to get access to God. And people died trying to go around and bypass this priestly system. So the high priest is the big guy. And as this author is making this argument in this book, we get to chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We get to chapter 7. And pretty soon, if you're sitting there in this audience, and you got one foot out the door, you're headed to Judaism, and he's trying to make the case that Jesus is the guy, he is the high priest. You're thinking, how is he the high priest? He's not from the tribe of Levi. He doesn't have the right pedigree. He doesn't have the right credentials. This can't be. When you're talking about Jesus as the high priest, he doesn't even fit that. He's a better priest, a better mediator. They're scratching their heads. And Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. And now this author, this preacher, is making the argument that Jesus is Judah's priest. And that's okay. The first thing he says is that Jesus changed the rules. It's a fascinating argument. The rules have changed. Why has the rule changed? Well, this is what he says, Hebrews 7:16. Jesus did not become a priest based on a legal regulation, talking about what was given at Mount Sinai, about physical descent, but based on the power of an indestructible life. That's a fancy way of saying it's not based on where Jesus came from, his point of origin. You see, Judah was not the line of the priests. Judah was the line of the kings. It's not about that origin. It's about the resurrection. The power of an indestructible life. That's what gives Jesus validity to be a high priest. The cross and resurrection. He's already made the point about the sacrifices. He's making the point that Jesus is not a high priest based on anything that they think they know. He's a high priest based on the cross and resurrection. The rules changed. Cross and resurrection changed everything. And then the second thing he says, you know what? There's precedent for all this. There's actually a guy in the Old Testament, and he reaches back to this figure that we read about earlier, this guy named Melchizedek. There's precedent for this. Melchizedek, we don't even know his origin. We don't know where he came from. There's a lot of speculation. We're not going to get into that this morning. All that to say is because he had really no point of origin, we're not told, he wasn't from Levi either. And yet here he is blessing Abraham, functioning as a priest with bread and wine, by the way. There's some echoes there we should connect with. He's blessing Abraham. He's functioning as a priest and a king. Not from Levi. So there's precedent for this. It's okay that Jesus is Judah's high priest. It's based on the cross and resurrection. Then he adds this. Because of the cross and resurrection, Jesus is a better high priest because, you know what? He doesn't die. All those other guys, including Aaron and his sons and all the people on down through the ages, almost close to 1,000 years of history there, they all died. He says this, because Jesus remains forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. Therefore, he's able to save completely those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede for them. So, because Jesus is forever, because Jesus is God himself, his intercession between God and people, that's forever. It doesn't go away. And he's made the point, Jesus is the one who has opened up the access to God. Remember how you couldn't go in? You can't come in. You can't come into the inner sanctum. You got to have help. There's only one guy that gets to do it every year. You know what? Jesus dies. That veil rips right down the middle from top to bottom. You have access. Jesus is providing you access. That raises the question, though. This all sounds like you're probably listening to me at this point. You're thinking, oh man, what is this kind of theology lesson? This is just stuffy theology. This is for the academics, the cranky guys, cranky theologians. Why are we spending all this time? And he does. He spends a big chunk of this sermon talking about Jesus' high priest. What does that do with us? What does that do with them? He makes the point that Jesus is the high priest that we need. It's interesting. He shifts to talking about we, us. Because now the author, the preacher, is all part of this. We need this high priest. And I will admit, I'm guilty of this. Yeah. We know Jesus is the high priest. We have access to God. Really? And I find myself, and I have found myself at times doing that. And part of it is, I suppose, because of our individualism, we latch onto this access to God bit, which is a big deal. We have access to God. We can come boldly, this preacher says at one point. They can come boldly to the throne of grace. Absolutely, we have access. But do you know, have you even stopped to think why you have access? Is it just because God says, okay, you can all come in now? He's making this point, what we consider to be some theological pie-in-the-sky stuff. He's making this point so that we understand it's not that simple. Jesus had to do this for us as a high priest. And it's because Jesus is a high priest that we do have this access to God. He is the ultimate high priest. And I make this point because I hear from time to time, again, as a pastor, people are, it's kind of fascinating the stuff they'll say to a pastor. It's fascinating the stuff they'll just say, period. But one thing I often hear, talking about table and where we're gathering in the community, you'll hear somebody say, yeah, you know what, I don't need that. I can get with God anytime. I can get God, I'll be with God on the surf. And, which is true. All right? Don't walk out of here, oh, hey, I heard Preston say. No. It is true. That's not the whole story. And what's certainly not the whole story is why. we can pray to God on the surf. We can pray to God on the golf course. But why is that true? It's because Jesus made it so. And some of this is anti-institutional bent as a culture, but is any of this because we chose Jesus and we had the good, we had the internal fortitude to make that great decision? I'm choosing Jesus today. Is that why we have access? No. The writer of Hebrews is trying to put that in front of us. No, this is because the high priest stepped out of the heavens to come here and fix this access problem for you. The writer says this. He actually says this. This is the high priest that we need. He says it twice in this chapter. I'm going to read one of them today. This high priest we need. Holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Now you take that list and park it, and just look at that list. Who's that describing? Holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners. We're talking about, this is God language. Which is kind of an interesting way of putting this. What he wants us to see is that when it comes to opening up access to God, God had to do it. God has to be God's own high priest. God is creating access to God. It's not going to be us. We're sinners. You need somebody like this. But I spend most of my day trying to access God myself. I'm a self-salvation freak. I'm always trying to save the argument, save the conversation, save the situation, save the circumstance. That's all self-salvation. What I need is a mediator, a high priest who says, stop it. You can't save yourself. Yeah, you can try. But this self-salvation bit, you need God to be your access to God. And just what is Jesus then doing in dying and rising to be our high priest? We already read it earlier. There are two things that showed up in that verse. He's able to save us completely. There's that, hey, you think you're saving yourself today? You think you're going to save yourself this week? No, you've got a high priest who is able to save you completely. Jesus is better than. And, oh, by the way, he always lives to intercede for us. By the way, before we go on, notice those two words. Completely and always. That's comprehensive. That's exhaustive. That's big. That's universal. That's all the time. Everywhere. There's no moment in your life where Jesus isn't doing this, where he's not saving you completely and he's not living to intercede for you. And trust me, we need intercession. I only think I know what I need to pray for. In fact, again, if you were to listen to Preston's prayers, kind of narcissistic. Guilty. I've got a Savior, I've got a high priest sitting at the right hand of God who is interceding on my behalf because Preston can't get it right. And I don't. Unfortunately, I've got a high priest who can, so I can come to God with these feeble prayers in confidence that whatever I get wrong in my prayers, Jesus has it. He's the high priest taking care of it all. So I don't know what to pray for, and the stuff that I'm praying for isn't quite right. You know what? The high priest has it. Jesus has it. That's why we have the confidence that this preacher has talked about. So Jesus is the high priest, then, that we need when the world is upside down. We don't know how to. We're less than 24 hours from what happened in Pennsylvania. We don't know what to pray for. We don't have the answers. And I challenge anybody that thinks they do. It's kind of why the Hebrews was written. We don't have all the answers. We live in a world of sin, sinners sin. That includes all of us. And in the coming days and weeks, there's going to be opinions, there's going to be inquiries, there's going to be investigations, people trying to take a stab at those answers, trying to get those answers, trying to understand their world. I don't know how many times I heard last night, I don't understand this. You're right. Nobody really understands this. How could this happen? We're going to spend the next few weeks trying to provide answers for that. And we're going to come up short because we are sinners ourselves. I mean, this is the world in which this preacher is preaching into their context. They're being hauled off to jail. Their houses are burning. They're being mocked. They've got friends who say life is better back in the synagogue. If you were back in the synagogue and you were back in Judaism, this wouldn't be happening. And you know what? They're being tempted, and some of them are. That is their context. That is our context. We need this kind of high priest. The kind of high priest that offers himself as a sacrifice in the place of sinners. One final point about the high priest. Talking about this access. There was one word other than access that you wanted to place over just what the high priest is doing and what he's supposed to do. Going all the way back to the garden. When God lines them up, Adam, Eve, and the serpent. And he says, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to be the one to fix this. See the woman. I'm going to fix this. It's going to be me. When he's doing that, though, Adam and Eve have to leave the garden. Humanity is now at war with the Creator. The creatures are at war with the Creator. God provides high priests to bring peace. Peace. There's one thing that the high priest is doing again and again and again and again. Every time he goes in to make atonement for sin, that one day a year, he's bringing peace. Peace. between God and sinners. That's the high priest that we need in this moment. We live in a world, and yesterday right in our faces, there's no peace. We don't have peace. So we need to come here and again and remind ourselves that we have somebody who is providing us peace in the midst of all that no peace. Jesus, our high priest, through cross and resurrection, is reconciling sinners and providing us peace. We don't deserve it, but he gives it to us anyway. That is our high priest. That's why when all this stuff goes down, whatever it is in our culture, in our society, we always have to come back to the cross and come back to the resurrection. Why? Because we don't have answers, but we have Jesus. Jesus, the high priest who dies and rises to give us peace. And that peace then flows through us to our neighbors, to our family members, the people we come in contact with. That's the kind of peace our high priest provides. Let's pray.